Lynched on CTV, proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88 at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled. Well, it looks as if the Christchurch City Council will sell off at least some of its assets. It needs to plug that potential $1.2 billion deficit, a figure that was originally thought to be $900 million. So why has it increased? Well, tonight, what are the answers and what are the best solutions? And Lynched starts right now. Good evening to you. The Council is proposing to raise $550 million from Christchurch-owned assets, but did it have any other choice? Answer, no. Later in the programme, we'll get reaction from NBR Christchurch reporter Chris Hutching on that announcement, but joining me now is Councillor Raf Manji, and good evening to you.
Good evening, Chris.
Did the Council have any other options?
No, I mean, we've been very clear all along that we need to pull all the levers, and that means asset sales, that means rates going up, it means cutting back on some of our expenditure, and trying to get some more money out of the government.
The shortfall was bigger than expected. Why?
Essentially, costs have gone up, and I mean that's no surprise. Our expenditures have not gone down, and that's another problem. So we haven't been able to cut the capital expenditure program as much as we would have liked. We've not been able to cut our operating expenses as much as we would have liked, and our infrastructure costs are blowing out.
It seems like every time there is a report about a report, the costs go up. Is that human nature? Is it a fault by anybody? But why?
I think it's just what happens in this sort of post-recovery situations that costs go up. We've got cost escalation happening all the time. Though I would say, if you remember back to some of our earlier conversations in the year, I said it was going to be a big number, bigger than we were actually reporting at the time. And I looked back through some of my notes, and I found one on the 14th of July where I had 1.2 billion put in. So I always thought it would come in at around this number.
Are you having a "see, I told you so" moment?
No, I'm just saying that we've got to be conservative. There are some potential options for bringing that number down, but we have to be very conservative. Remember, we're trying to produce a draft financial strategy for the Auditor General's office so they can actually have a look and say, is the council a going concern and can it meet its liabilities?
Well, can it then?
Yep.
34% are roughly that of Littleton Port. How did you come to that figure? How did you come to that decision? Because so far that's the largest amount, isn't it, that you're talking here in terms of flicking off some silver?
Yeah, I mean, we've said publicly the port and the airport, but specifically the port, are the two assets that are in most need of a strategic partner. So the port is having its lunch eaten by the Tauranga-Timaru tie-up. We've lost some contracts. The Fonterra contract we lost, which was I think 5 million units a year. So, we really need to do something with the port. We need to make it attractive to get a good, smart investor in there to actually boost that business. Because, I mean, when we look at people go on a lot about the dividends, okay? They don't realise actually that the cash returns we've been getting out of these assets have not actually been that good, okay?
But isn't it amazing you're saying this now? Because when you say this, all I can think back recently, Peter Davey and his massive, obscene bonuses. And in a way, you're sort of telling me that the Littleton Port isn't a great performer.
Well, what I'm saying is obviously post-earthquake it's been struggling, so it hasn't been paying any dividends. In 2013 we got a $2 million dividend. Remember, this is a $400 million company, so that's peanuts. But even going back to 2010, the dividend was only $5 million, so it hasn't been a huge performer in terms of dividend return to the council. Obviously Orion is our cash cow, that's been returning good dividends, but even that's around sort of 4.5% when we compare it to the actual value that we could get if we sold it. So we're not earning huge amounts, so there's this slight myth out there that these dividends are keeping the rates down. Actually, you know what? The dividend return is way lower than our cost of capital. If we didn't have any debt, it would be good, but we do. Well, so we're actually paying more for our debt than we're receiving in terms of dividend yield.
All night about that then, but I won't because we need to move on. 9% in Christchurch International Airport still doesn't sound like much. In fact, Jerry Brownlee even said on RNZ on Friday, it's a step in the right direction, but almost the council was too timid. Do you think he's referring to the fact that only 9% in the airport, for example? What do you think he means by too timid?
Yeah, probably we could have gone a bit higher. But just to go back to the 9%, that assumes that the Crown will sell down their 25%. So it will actually be a 34% sell down in the airport, which will take us to 66%. The reason we've chosen 66% is that keeps the tax loss grouping. So if you own 66% of companies within your group, you can share the tax losses around so that there's some benefit towards that. So 9% doesn't sound much, but if the Crown comes in with us, that'll be a 34% stake for that.
Perhaps a success story, I think it's a success story, is Orion. 14.3%. Again, I want to ask you the same question.
Yep.
How did you come to that figure? How did you come to that decision?
That takes us down to 75%, which gives us complete control in terms of special resolutions, and it's just a number that people, picked. Ultimately, I mean, there's no surprise about this. This was a consensus decision, so it was a decision where all councillors could agree. Clearly, some councillors would have liked less, some councillors would have liked more, but I think we reached a reasonable decision, and obviously with the option of going back to the jam jar if we need to.
It seems to me, and I might be wrong about this, but public feedback on this appears to be in your favour. Is that a fair comment to make? On Talkback today, nobody was complaining.
Yeah.
I think, is there a realisation that the council needed to do something, and if it's going to sell a little bit here and there, no problem. What has reaction been like from the public?
Yeah, I mean, certainly all year I've had that reaction. Every single person I've spoken to has really said, you need to get the finances sorted out. And if you have to sell down some assets, that's fine. Just make sure you keep strategic control. And I think in the engagement process that we went through recently, the kind of Your Voice and Smart Choices campaign, there was a mixture. There were a lot of people saying, don't sell anything. There were also people saying, if you do sell something, make sure you keep strategic control. And some people saying, sell the whole lot. The thing in these consultation processes, there's actually the more activist segment of the population tends to get involved. I actually have not met anyone who's ever taken part in any consultation process, but they have quite a strong opinion. You might hear some of those on your radio show. They might write letters to the newspaper. Generally, I think they're pretty happy with what we've come up with. And remember, this is only one part of the solution. The other part of the solution people may not be so thrilled about.
And I want to come to rate shortly, but this $1.2 billion, does that take into account anything to do with the anchor projects?
Yes.
Because what I can't understand for the life of me is how can you possibly make these decisions when we don't know the long-term future ownership of some of these projects? We don't know the liability. Is it the taxpayers, the ratepayers, the council, what? How can we possibly work out a plan when we don't know the ongoing liability for some of these major projects? It seems absurd.
Well, that's based on...
And I don't blame the council for that, I blame the government.
That's based on what we know, that's based on what we have agreed to do and the operating expenses that we know. Now, anything new that comes up, that will be a different conversation. So if we look at the convention centre, which still a lot of people out there think the council is building, we're not. It is a government project. At some point, the government will probably seek to hand that back to somebody, probably the council, and it might be 8 to 10 years away. If that happens, we will have a conversation which will look at what are those operating liabilities. And this is all part of the conversation that we're going to have with the Crown over the next 6 months.
The good news, I suppose, is that there's still flexibility with this so-called cost-sharing agreement. Once again, it's not set in stone. You can defer the stadium till 1895 or whatever, you know what I'm saying? So is it the same for all the other anchor projects? The scope can be reduced. The flexibility of who pays for what is still there, right?
Yeah, the realisation that everyone is coming to, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who said we knew that was going to happen, is that the whole escapade is underfunded. And we're now going to have a conversation about the trade-offs. Which things do we really want the most? What is most important to people? And that's what the consultation process around the long-term plan will bring out.
All right. Raf Menji is my guest tonight. When we return, EMBR Christchurch reporter Chris Hutching will join us in the studio as well. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. Joining Councillor Raf Menji in the studio is MBR reporter Chris Hutching. Hello, Chris. Good to have you on the show.
G'day, Chris.
What do you make of this package?
Well, I think it's a carefully calculated political document that steers a fairly cautious sort of path. There are some people in the city that would be opposed to asset sales no matter what. We sort of know who they are. They're the usual people that you ring up. But I think this one has been calculated so that people won't be too alarmed. There are some things that I couldn't quite understand why they were left out of the package. For example, I would have thought that city care would be right at the top of the list, and I do wonder if there are some political reasons for that. Perhaps it's something to do with the number of people they employ in the city. I'm I'm not sure.
Well, Raf Manji is here now. Raf, why was City Care not up on that list? Because there was a lot of talk that it probably would be. Flick it off, not a great performer, get rid of it. Is Chris Hutching right to suggest it employs a lot of people? Is there more to this than something?
I mean, I think the simple explanation is there wasn't agreement on it. But what we have done...
So councillors couldn't come to a general consensus as to what to do?
Yep. So what we have done, though, is say that we will be consulting on removing them from the Strategic Asset Register, which means we can come back and revisit that.
Okay. So it's still on the cards?
Still on the cards.
All right. I guess the other question that we need to ask, isn't it, Chris, is rates.
Well, rates is becoming an increasingly big issue. By the time you take your insurances into account, your other annual costs for things that you do, this council has to be very careful that they don't price people out of Christchurch. Heaven forbid, sometimes I have a look at our household expenses and I think, how am I going to cope with these household expenses when I'm not earning as much money as I am now? And possibly I won't be able to. I may have to probably sell down. So we don't want to price out a generation of people. There's no question what this package means. It means that you're selling assets now to have money now so that you can spend it on things now and you'll have less of that money in terms of dividends later. But because of the unusual things that we've been through, that's the way it is.
In your view, Chris Hutching, was this the only option then?
Well, there's never only an only option. But certainly it seems to be a reasonably calculated option. I must admit I had missed the wee bit about the government selling its share in the airport company. Have they expressed their desire to do that?
I mean, that is not confirmed. It's a conversation that we will have with them.
What about rates then? Because there was nothing really said about that, and I think that's what everybody is wanting to know. Of course, what we do know is this is what fixing or potentially going to raise $550 million. Where's the other half going to come from? Yep. And what is the answer to that?
Well, I mean, again, when I was interviewed on the radio on Friday evening after the announcement, I was very open with people to say that rates will still probably be going up by 40 to 45% over the next 5 years.
What's that in terms of annually? Okay,
so rates at the moment, on average per household, is around $2,100 per household. It will go up to just under $3,000. So it's a reasonable hike. If you look at where Wellington and Auckland are now, they're well over 3,000. Obviously, Auckland is a little bit higher. So we are catching up a little bit more with the bigger cities. Rates here have been quite low. And this is going to be the balancing issue. This is going to be the question, I think, when people make the trade-offs. How much do they want to pay in rates? How much do they want to eat into their asset base? And weigh that up. And actually, one of the things we will be hopefully doing is putting an online budget calculator on the web when we do launch the draft long-term plan and the consultation, so that people can play around and see, well, if we have rates here, what does that do to everything else? So, I mean, that, you know...
Have you thought about it in relation to the average earnings of households in Christchurch versus Auckland, which are considerably less?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, all those considerations will come in. So if we want to bring in rates a little bit lower, there's a few things we need to do. We might have to sell down a little bit more, but we might have to cut our expenditure. That's the reality. We'll have to spend less.
Some other councils have said this is not to do with... it's not an argument between rate increase and selling off assets. But it is exactly that, isn't it? Because you've got two major options here, that one that's going to probably initially affect more ratepayers than the other.
Yeah, but like I say, cutting expenditure is another one. So if ratepayers come back and say, we've already deferred the stadium, if ratepayers come back and say, look, actually, we don't want you to build this, we don't want you to build that, we really want to cut some of those operating costs, then we'll certainly have a look at it. It's been very difficult. I mean, we've gone through this whole long-term plan. It's been very difficult to cut expenditure within the council. Reducing levels of service, people won't like that. So everywhere you look, something's got to give. That is the reality.
Do you think there's any fat inside the council, for example, that could be cut?
Well, I wouldn't know really, because I don't work there. Raf may have a better idea than I do. But I do think things like the deferral of the stadium was a very wise move, and apart from people who are very strong about the rugby lobby, I think it'll be generally supported. It's a great pity that the government is not taking us more into their confidence about things such as the convention centre. In fact, Sarah, CCDU, goodness knows what they do, I don't know. I'm supposed to be a journalist that's supposed to know about these things. They're like Fort Knox, they tell us nothing. They hold little briefings where you hear second-hand things that they've told stakeholders and selected business people.
Is that simply because, though, they've become more of a public relations machine on behalf of the government than actually remembering their mandate, which was to speed up the recovery of Christchurch. I want to ask you that question, Chris, first, and I want to ask Raf's opinion on that.
If they were a public relations machine, I don't really see much of it. Now, there were some studies done, commissioned by Matthew Hooton, who did some work for them about 2 years ago now. I've managed to receive some of the reports. He came up with a lot of recommendations about how they could engage more meaningfully with the community. They've all been ignored. So really, if they are a public relations machine, well, where are the public relations?
Raf Manji, what do you see in the performance of Sarah?
Well, look, I mean, it's not my organisation. You know, we obviously interact.
But you said to me, I'll tell you why I asked that question.
Yeah.
You said to me on the program about, I don't know, was it 6-7 months ago now? It seems like a lifetime. Yeah. You were concerned about the duplication within Sarah, right? To me, that probably still exists because now the council feels it needs to create another separate authority as a one-stop shop for private investment. Yeah. Well, I was looking at an article you did about a year ago, Chris Hutching, and you said that there was there were 2 new business units being set up by the CCDU and Sarah to deal with private investments. What the hell is going on here?
I think we're in a process of transition. So Sarah is starting
Warwick Isaacs on Newstalk ZB today told me these 2 business agencies within Sarah will continue to exist. So
well, I mean, that's fine.
There's no winding down, and that concerns me.
They have their responsibilities. I mean, clearly there's been a change now with DPMC taking over. Our role as council is to make sure that we're front-footing any investment opportunities coming into the city, and that's what the DA is all about. It's about actually saying it's best to do these types of things at arm's length in a more kind of commercial structure with commercial people. You still have the political oversight. The politicians will still sign off and support the decisions, but these guys actually do all the heavy lifting and the preparation and the work, and we need to have a very, very quick decision-making process. And I mean, our focus actually is the whole city, not just the central city. I mean, Sarah and CCDU are focused on the central city, and there have been issues. They've been well reported. We're interested also in the suburban centres and actually community development and, you know, trying to get other models into that.
So, Chris, do you see this then, the council new authority, as something that's actually needed? Is it warranted?
Well, I can buy Ruff's argument. I can buy Ruff's argument about the wider Christchurch community for sure. But as for what's going on in the central city, let's face it, there are, at my count, 2 buildings, I think, where the foundations are coming out of the ground, which are the Justice and Emergency Services Precinct. 2 buildings, and we've seen that work all along the Avon riverbank. Now, is that the sum total in 3 years, 3 to 4 years of what Sarah CCDU have achieved? We know that they're about a year behind where they should be, partly because they ignored a lot of advice about how to go about engaging business people and local business people. Now, it's not entirely their fault, but we know that hundreds of millions of dollars have flowed out of the city to places like Auckland, and that's a crying shame, and I don't think it had to happen to that degree.
We need to take a commercial break. I want to come back and pick you up on that. We'll be right back here on Lynched on CTV. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. Councillor Raf Manji is in the studio along with NBR reporter Chris Hutching. Why has the capital expenditure program increased, Raf Manji?
Well, I mean, there's huge demands on infrastructure. You know, staff actually came with an original package which was, you know, way over the original budget, and they did a great job at getting it back down to where it needed to be, around sort of 3.5, 3.6 billion over the next 10 years. Councillors have added to that instead of cut, and it's actually, that's the problem. It's very, very difficult. We're trying to invest in the city.
Well, hang on,
so
what do you mean councillors have added to that?
Well, you know, a
swimming
swimming pool here, you know, bike lanes are more expensive. I mean, you know, these things add, and they're things that we want to do. They're things that will be, you know, will pay back in the future, and they're just extra costs now. So it's, you know, what do we invest in or what do we cut? That is the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves.
Chris Hutching, what do we invest in and what do we cut?
Well, everybody's got their hobby horse. I wrote a story today on the subject, and somebody commented and said, cut the cycle lanes, we don't need 100 million spent on that. Otherwise, you could spend it on stadiums or risk Christchurch becoming a sporting backwater. Well, you know, to my mind, I'm not too worried about us becoming a sporting backwater, but some people are. So, you know, everybody's got their little wish list and hobby horse. We've got the social housing thing, which mystifies me a little bit. We seem to be, instead of cutting in some areas, we're talking about spending more in terms of social housing. But I assume that all the councillors have decided that this is a public good that we cannot do without.
But it's a done deal, isn't it, Ref Menji, the social housing issue?
Yeah,
Vicky Buck's baby.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're still working through the details. And the fact is we all want more houses to be built. The question is, how do you do it?
One thing I'm mystified too a little bit about is the insurance situation, Ruff. I mean, where has that ended up? We had a lot of criticism of our former chief executive who supposedly...
took the money and ran?
Well, I wasn't going to say that, Chris, but you have.
Thank you.
So, how much of a shortfall is attributed to that kind of competence or incompetence?
Okay, that's a difficult one. I mean, in terms of the numbers, we can't talk about that. We do have numbers on the table with the reinsurers. They made an offer back in the middle of the year. Our CFO's just been in New York and we have a counter offer on the table, so we're working through that process. I think what has become really clear to me over this last year is how far behind the council was in its insurance claim process. I mean, it was miles behind. You know, it's taken us all year to get all our claims in. They should have been done well before that. And, you know, I mean, the story about the insurance, I mean, you know, everyone's written about that. Clearly that was, you know, a disaster, and at some point we will go back and review that. It's not the priority right now, but once we've cleared off the settlement, then we'll go back and tidy up those loose ends.
It's interesting, I did a little bit of research in the Companies Office the other day, and unless it's out of date, that gentleman that we were talking about before is still a director on the parent company of Civic.
Tony Marriott.
Yeah, yeah, he is. Yeah. I mean, clearly, I mean, that was a conflict of interest. That should never have happened, but it did, and we have to deal with it.
Essentially, the city was underinsured, wasn't it? Is that right to say that now?
I think it was more that it was poorly insured. The city understood that it had a different type of insurance contract to the one that it seems to have. So there was a lot of switching around of the insurance contract between 2008 and 2010 for no good reason, as far as I can see, apart from maybe saving a small amount of money. And that's where the conflict was. Obviously, the previous CEO was a director of the insurance company it got moved to. And clearly, as the chief executive, that shouldn't have been happening. It's
amazing. You can work at a council organisation and underperform and get a massive golden handshake. But anyway, we can't go there.
Well, there wasn't the proper oversight. That's the problem. Now we have a new audit and risk management committee. That kind of stuff comes through the committee, and councillors get an eye on it. Previously in the olden days, councillors used to approve the insurance. Then probably sometime in the mid-2000s, it reverted to management, and they had complete control over that.
So is this the committee system that you're talking about? Which is
the Audit and Risk Management Committee. So that's newly set up this year. We have an independent chair, who's Sue Sheldon, who's doing a brilliant job, and we're just trying to get some more rigour into the risk management processes within the organisation.
Ref, tell us about the time frame for all of these decisions to be made, particularly the one that was announced on Friday. So now it goes out to public consultation. This is essentially part of the long-term plan, isn't it?
Yes. So a consultation document will go out in February. We will meet again with the Crown at the end of January and have the next round of discussions on where we're going to end up with all of our cost sharing and squaring up. We go out for consultation. We'll have hearings, I think, sometimes in March, April. We will make a final decision in June to adopt the long-term plan. At that point, we want to have everything tied up.
That includes telling the public how much rates will increase?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. You think you've got the public backing?
I think so.
So far?
Yes, I think so far. I mean, what will be interesting is really how much can the public take in terms of rates increases. That's the tester.
I was going to say,
what is reasonable then?
I mean, so what we've got at the moment programmed into the model is 13% next year, then 5, then 12, then
30.
5 and 5. And that adds up to about 45% cumulative over 5 years. The question is, can we get that? Is that too much for people to bear? Now, we don't know that yet, so that's what we need to test.
Chris Hutching, you went ouch.
I did get ouch. It was 13, wasn't it?
It's a
That's
lot.
an unlucky number.
If the rating base increases, which we hope it will do, there's a lot of units coming online, that will bring those numbers down. We started off by thinking, can we keep this below 10%?
Well, that's another reason for getting the central city back on its feet before too long and getting businesses back there, because that makes a big difference to the amount of rates you can raise.
Correct. We're out of time. Chris Hutching, Ref Manji, thanks so much for coming into the program tonight. Really appreciate your time. And have your say on tonight's program, head to my Facebook page, facebook.com/Lynched in NZ. We'll see you next week. Lynched on CTV was proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88, at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled.